Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming tonight to listen to my 25-year study on the Pacific War that culminated in this book that came out a few years ago in 2020. And I say 25 years is, it might be a little hyperbolic, but when I was studying under James Crowley, Paul Kennedy, Jeffrey Parker at Yale University, I did an awful lot of study of just World War II in general. And so I studied a lot of the Pacific War. I had an uncle, Frank Rigg, who fought the Japanese at Peleliu. So I learned a lot about the Pacific War growing up as a young child because of him. And I've always been interested in World War II history in general. And then I had the opportunity to do a study of the Pacific naval engagements under Paul Kennedy. And then I was able to study about the, Japan's imperialistic goals under James Crowley. And then Jeffrey Parker, I just studied World War II in general. And then when I was at Cambridge, I studied more of World War II in general, focusing on primarily the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, but also studying an awful lot about Japan under Jonathan Steinberg. I am primarily a World War II European historian and Holocaust historian, but this work really came about by accident. Flamethrower, as you see the copy of the cover here. It happened when I went on a trip to Iwo Jima in 2015, and I went there with my 12-year-old son. And I wanted to do what a lot of Marines like to do, go kind of touch our Mecca, if you will. Iwo Jima, one of the most revered battles in Marine Corps history and in military history for that matter. And I wanted to go there with my son, teach him that freedom is not free, have him interview a lot of the veterans. I knew there was going to be around 60 veterans on this trip with 400 family members. It was for the 70th commemoration of that battle. Well, while I was there, and I'm a Marine Corps officer, I was meeting a whole bunch of other Marines. General Dumford, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, was there. There was also many prominent individuals, the Governor of Guam. You had several, Marine Corps officers who had different staff positions of leadership and training in Quantico. That were there. So it was really a wonderful experience. And as I was running around the island of Guam and Iwo Jima, because we looked at both of these battles, we came into touch with the last Marine Corps Medal of Honor recipient, Woody Williams. And he's featured here in this picture. And as I started getting to know him more, I found out that he had never written up his life, and that nobody had ever written up his life, and he had an interesting story to tell. And it was amazing everywhere he went, the reverence people showed him. And on this trip, this tour that I was on, there was a couple of guys who had actually served with him and were in his unit there in Guam and Iwo Jima. And I thought, how cool is that? So after this experience with Woody Williams, I thought, okay, I've been studying the Pacific War for 20 plus years. I taught it on the college level when I was a professor. I've only written about basically Nazi Germany and World War II in the European theater and the Holocaust. I want to do something for my country. I want to do something for my Marine Corps. And I want to focus on the Pacific War and really try to help people understand the enemy we face, because the more I have studied Japan throughout the years, the more horrified I am about just how grotesque Imperial Japan was. And I'm about to bring out a book, you ladies and gentlemen will be happy to know, in the next year, called Japan's Holocaust, which to my knowledge will be the only and the definitive work thereby, a work on looking at the entire history of Imperial Japan from 1927 to 45 and looking at their mass murder, their Holocaust, if you will. There's been tons of historians throughout the year that have years who have looked at the Nazi genocide. And most often when people use the Greek term Holocaust, they are thinking of the 6 million Jews who died. But a lot of Jews don't like the term Holocaust because the Greek term it really means a burnt offering, a sacrifice. And the Jews, are saying we weren't sacrificed for anything. It is not a sacrifice. They like to call it the Shoah, which in Hebrew means destruction. So that's one reason why I like to use the term Holocaust for the Japans, because it also can mean mass murder. And a lot of people refer to it as such after the war. But one reason why it hasn't really been documented a lot is that the intelligentsia that was required to study the mass murder the Japanese conducted, you would think would have been the Chinese, just like the Jews after World War II that survived and were in England and America and Canada, and a few that remained in Europe, and then several of the refugees that went to Israel. They had a reason to really document this, to set up an identity in Israel, never again. Also, why did this happen? How could this happen? Many of these people focused on that, but you really didn't have that in the Pacific realm, because Mao took over China in the late 40s, kicked Chiang Kai-shek out to Taiwan, as many of you know, and where all the archives were, and a lot of the people who were learned were not taking care of the archives, and a lot of the people who were learned he was killing. The proletariat rise up and so on. And Mao, as many of you know, was a mass murdering thug himself. According to Hallowell and Jung, husband-wife team that just wrote a biography of Mao about 10 years ago, they estimate that around 70 million people were slaughtered by Mao from his reign from 1926 to 1976. So it's very hard for Mao to point the finger at Japan saying, look, you slaughtered to 30 million of my people, when he's slaughtering his own people. So that's one reason why there's not a lot of historiography on this as well. But after this experience, to come full circle, meeting Woody, I was like, okay, I can use his story to tell the larger story of America and the Marine Corps during World War II, and then also really tell the story about Japan and the enemy we face. So that's how I got into this. And that's why I say it's about 25 years of study, because I had already read hundreds of books on the Pacific War and I have them all in my library, had made notes, and it was very easy once I was learning more about Woody's life, of putting his life within the history and taking all those notes I'd made throughout the years and then bringing it into a work. Also, something that's very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that many people don't know. We have a National Archives in St. Louis that focuses on personnel files. And unfortunately, in the early 70s, 11 million out of the 12 million Army files from World War II did go up in flames. But all the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps files, personnel files, survived. So what was really interesting is that as I went into the key figures of these campaigns that I was focusing on, and then the men that I met, I was able to go to St. Louis and pull their personnel files, most of which have never been seen and looked at since 1945, which was a treasure trove of information. For those of you who do me the honor of buying this book, you'll see it is a very healthy work. It's 1,000 pages. It has 3,400 footnotes. Half of those are from primary sources in our archives and in Chinese and Japanese archives that have never seen the light of day. And so for those of you who are interested in knowing more about your ancestors or friends, family members who fought in the Pacific War, who were in the Navy or Marine Corps, if you want to get their personnel files, they're there. So when I was on this trip, I was meeting all these other veterans. Almost everyone you see in this picture, I found their personnel files, I interviewed them, and I've incorporated their stories into this book. I like, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic here, I like to call my book the Band of Brothers for the Marine Corps. If you like the movie Band of Brothers, then I think you will love this work, because you really get to know every one of these guys, and I intertwined their stories with Woody, who's prominently in the middle of this picture, with the little Indian thing on his name tag right there in the middle in the white shirt. He's the main character, obviously, but all these guys are intertwined in the story as well. And nobody really has ever heard their stories. As I was saying, some of the people I was meeting there were former Marine Corps JAG officer here to the left, Charles Jones, who writes a lot about history. He wrote a very good work on Pearl Harbor a few years ago. He was a good proofreader for me. And then the guy to Woody's left, the guy in the right-hand side of the picture, is Lefty Lee, who was in Woody's company, which was really remarkable. And at this time, Lefty was presenting himself of being one of the riflemen that protected Woody on Iwo Jima, and had a very elaborate tale about how he did so. But I later found out he was a stolen valor case and was never there. He had made up the whole story. But it was very interesting unwinding that story. Also, I found a lot of controversy about Woody Williams, Medal of Honor recipient here, that probably half of the things that were reported that he did, that he actually was reporting himself, that got into the official record, did not happen, but his command believed it did. And that's one reason why he got the medal. If the real events were put into his file, he should not have gotten the medal. In fact, he's the only Marine Corps recipient, Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, that never got the sign off from Fleet Admiral Nimitz, Commandant of the Marine Corps Vandergriff, and Fleet Marine Force Commander General Roy Geiger. They refused to do it because they saw eventually the problems with the evidence, but politically Truman took it away from the process and pushed it through. So POTUS got his live Medal of Honor to recipients to award medals to in October. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. At the time when I was meeting these guys, I thought, how cool was it to have an actual witness to Woody's Medal of Honor deeds and be able to put it all together. So with my son, I'm having him meet all these wonderful veterans. This was Fisk Hanley, who just wrote a book about his experience. He was a POW in Japan. He got shot down on a bombing raid on Tokyo. He was a flight engineer on a B-29, just a wonderful guy, and an interesting story of how he survived. I met Japanese veterans that fought on Iwo Jima.
Bryan, can you just hide the where it says Zoom, that little white box, and hit the hide? Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. I'm kind of new at this. So, to understand a little bit of the Japanese mindset at this time, Japan, when Admiral Perry opened up the doors to Japan in 1854 with the Black Ships, Japan was a very backward, very feudalistic, very isolated nation. But they quickly mobilized their nation. They quickly industrialized. And then, of course, they shocked the world in 1904, 1905 when they defeated both the Pacific and the Atlantic Russian fleets. And they started doing what they felt was what you do when you're a first world power. They looked at Britain and India. They looked at Germany and France all throughout Africa and the Caribbean. They looked at America, throughout, South America and the Caribbean as well. And like, we got to start taking over, parts of Asia. And it just kept on feeding itself throughout. After World War I, they took over parts of China. 31, they took over Manchuria. They had taken Okinawa, earlier, after they defeated Russia. And we didn't like that a lot. We were already in Asia. We did not want Japan to, basically infringe upon our influence. And Japan felt a lot of resentment here because America and Great Britain in particular were always putting up roadblocks. And so the propaganda at this time was always showing Japan needs to rule Asia. Asia is Japan's manifest destiny, just like Mexico and the south of the part of the United States was America's manifest destiny in Hawaii. They need to just leave us alone. And of course, we weren't doing that. Japan, with the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894, 1895, got Taiwan, got Okinawa. They solidified those gains after defeating Russia. They kept on spreading out. And then by 1937, when they did the second Sino-Japanese war, they took over basically the landmass of half the size of the United States and China. This is General Matsui in his victory parade in Nanking. And a lot of people know about the rape of Nanking. Make a long story short, from the Battle of September, October of 37 in Shanghai, and him leading the Shanghai Expeditionary Force after they defeated the Chinese national forces there and pushed inward to take over Nanking, 170 miles to the west, which was the capital of Chiang Kai-shek's national capital of his nation. They thought by taking that, they could possibly bring China to its knees and all of China over to Japan. In this campaign from basically September, October 1937 till basically March of 38, they took over the landmass of the equivalent of Connecticut, and minimum, they slaughtered 300,000 people, and minimum, and I give all the evidence in my book, they raped 80,000 women. It's very hard for me to get my head wrapped around the Japanese Imperial Army. Everywhere they went, they raped. They raped everything: little boys, women, old ladies, infants, everything. It was just their modus operandi. It was almost like a sign of manhood to do this. And then quite often they would slaughter the people that they raped. POWs. It's interesting, we suffered around 40% of all POWs, Allied POWs in Japanese camps died, in comparison to about the 6% that did so in Nazi POW camps. Sometimes that number is down to 3%, depending on which studies you look at. But when you look at Chinese POWs, at the end of the war, although they took millions, captive from 1927 to 1945, there was only 60 Chinese POWs and Japanese POW camps. They were basically slaughtered immediately when they were taken. And so this rape of Nanking, though, is just one example of many campaigns. I could write countless books on the rape of Beijing, the rape of Shanghai, the rape of Canton, the rape of Hong Kong, the rape of Guam, the rape of Philippines, rape of Manila. Everywhere they went, they raped and slaughtered. That was the Japanese military way. This is an example of a lot of soldiers that they slaughtered at Nanking. And what's interesting here, to get to Iwo Jima and Guam, talking about Woody Williams, a lot of the men garrisoned there, in particular the commander, General Kuribayashi, were involved with all these campaigns. They had been doing this for years. So by the time we got to Iwo Jima and we're fighting these guys were hardened rapists, criminals, murderers, if you will, and also very committed fighters. Here in Nanking, you see in the picture on the left, all the guys' hands behind their backs. Usually they were machine gun sprayed or they were bayoneted. And then they try to do a crude on the right side, a crude form of trying to hide the evidence. You see the wood, and now the bodies are much blacker than they are on the other side. It's because they tried to burn them up. They didn't do a very good job. I went to the museum in Nanking, China, and it's built over a graveyard, literally, guys, of 10,000 skeletons. And I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to Sachsenhausen, I've been to Dachau, I've been to Yad Vashem in Israel, I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've never been to a place that is so dramatic, a museum to victims, as I experienced there at Nanking. This picture is a 30-foot statue of a mother holding her child who had been slaughtered by the Japanese, and it's based off a real photograph. And what's interesting is, when you know the history behind the photograph, is this mother, she has been raped, You see a little bit of that with her breast being exposed. She was raped. Her child was slaughtered in front of her. And then as she is protesting this, the Japanese around her take out their cameras laughing and taking pictures. This is something else that's really hard for to get around my head is Japanese everywhere they went, they had their cameras just like the Nazis, and they were continually laughing at the misery they were inflicting on people. A very barbaric nation, Japan at this time. This is one of the killing pits that you walk around in this museum. You're basically in this huge auditorium, and you look over a banister, and they had excavated. This is one of the killing fields, and this is, I think, has 18 bodies. And when you look closer, you'll see decapitated head, crushed heads, bullets, and skulls, and so on. This is what they were doing all over China, slicing off heads. This was initiation. You see the guys in the background with their cameras. This was their modus operandi. This is some more other scenes on Nanking that you see with the skeletons. This is one of the horrific photographs I found that Japan's take. When they would rape girls, they would rape them for days, and then they would kill them, and then they would place them out in the city streets, as you see, with pieces of twigs and bamboo stuck into their orifices to basically humiliate the population. And they would be laughing and taking pictures of this. And I just, I would think to myself when I saw countless of those photographs, like, what type of women raised these guys? What relationship do they have to their grandmothers and aunts and their sisters and so on to destroy the womanhood, the flower of any population that creates people everywhere they went. They also would bury people alive. Here's another scene of them having people dig their own graves and then bury them alive. So now this is the enemy that we're dealing with. We're dealing with a very brutal populace. They had been fighting by the time Pearl Harbor happened for 14 years. So basically a generation and a half of young men had been seasoned in China. And they were very efficient, very hard warriors, not very flexible in their thinking. If their officers or NCOs got killed, a lot of times they were lost at what they would do. But one thing you could be sure that they would never surrender. And if they took you prisoner, you were going to die a horrible death. Now, a lot of people asked about Pearl Harbor, and I'm with a very sophisticated group here, so I don't have to go into all the particulars. One thing I do want to say that I did that a lot of people don't do, and that is I go to all the archives and I find the truth. And with Yamamoto here, as many of you recognize, he's touted on the History Channel and in several books that he was a Harvard-trained, gentleman. He did attend Harvard. He went to a few classes, but he dropped. Please, ladies and gentlemen, if please put your computers on mute. I hear voices in the back. He did not study at Harvard per se. He was in a few classes, but he was on spy duties, and he never got any completion of courses. And the reason I know this is because I got his transcript from Harvard. Very few people have done that. So, I just saw a History Channel on Pearl Harbor saying that he was, he studied and was trained at Harvard. No, he attended it. But a lot of Japanese admirals did. Kuribayashi actually did attend Harvard. He completed 3 courses, got a D+ in English, did a little bit better in history. But Japan at this time was sending a lot of its creme de la creme over to America to get educated and to build out relationships and to spy on our country. Now, December 7th, we were very isolationist country. We didn't really care about the rape of Nanking's going on, even though we knew Japan was raping and slaughtering everywhere, kind of like the Rwanda genocide recently. They're poor Black people, so who cares? We don't want to really get involved. We eventually do get involved, but we're usually late to the party, just like, with the Holocaust with the Jews. We knew a lot of stuff that was going on in the 30s, but until Hitler declared war against us soon after December 7th, we were very isolationist and didn't want to get involved. Pearl Harbor really brought us on with a vengeance. And Yamamoto knew this was not a good decision. But he also knew if Japan was going to go get the oil in Indonesia, which was the plan, because we were cutting it off, Britain and us were cutting it off because we were doing sanctions against them. And they knew if they were going to get oil in Indonesia and attack the Dutch there, the British West Indies, that they were going to have to do everything they could to get us out of the way from interfering with activities in Asia. And so that's where one reason out of many of where the birth of this attack on Pearl Harbor happened. There's the Arizona, as many of you know. Now, Hong Kong, a lot of people don't realize Hong Kong was taken at this time, was attacked on December 8th. So December 7th, because of the timeline on the globe. And General Kuribayashi was second in command of the 23rd Army that took over Hong Kong. And he was the garrison commander at Iwo Jima, made famous by Clint Eastwood's movies, Letters from Iwo Jima and The Flags of Our Fathers. What's interesting is when Hong Kong was taken over, basically in a month, 50,000 civilians were slaughtered by these guys that you see here and others, and at least 20,000 rapes of women. And Kuribayashi did nothing to curtail this. In fact, he imported a few weeks later 2,000 women on cattle cars from Canton to service his men as comfort women. So he was all part of this horrible organization, which is something that Clint Eastwood did not go into in his movies. This is the victory parade in Hong Kong. The leader of the 23rd Army was General Sakai. He's the one with the glasses. And the guy right behind him in Army uniform, not the admiral, but in Army uniform, that's General Kuribayashi. Now, I'm constantly shocked that people do not know that Japan was the only modern nation at this time that was still ruled by a god. Hirohito was thought to be an offspring of the Amaterasu, the sun god, and was thought to be able to speak with the gods and then impart the wisdom to his underlings. He was infallible. And they really did view him as, Christians would view Jesus. And it's hard for people to get their heads around the notion or the fact that Hirohito sending his troops into battle and telling them to, never surrender and whatnot. We basically were fighting a nation of religious nut jobs. Like, if the jihadists today had a modern war, a nation that they could organize and build weapons and still keep their theocratic beliefs close to their heart, that's what Japan was at this time period. It was like sending a whole bunch of millions of Taliban fighters, well-trained and organized, willing to die for the emperor and commit suicide doing so, and becoming gods themselves. I mean, like, the Islamic nut jobs that we are fighting throughout the world today, they believe if they kill themselves in a suicide attack, they get 72 virgins. Well, the Japanese believe that they would become gods in the Shinto religion, or they would be reincarnated into a stronger form if they were leaning more to the Zen Buddhist. And this is what's interesting. When I studied Zen Buddhism and Shintoism at this time, you would think the Zen Buddhists were all about peace and love and so on, which is what they promote today. But back then, the Zen Buddhists and the Shinto theology was fascist left and right, totalitarian, aggressive, imperialistic. It's very interesting how the religions at that time period mirrored the aggressive political stance that Hirohito and his underlings embraced. Here's a picture, a map actually that was carried by one of Woody's lieutenants that I got to meet the family and kind of give you a feel for the Pacific. I'm constantly shocked when I give lectures at how ignorant people are of the Pacific and the islands and the places that we're fighting. So, I think this audience, you know where Iwo Jima is in Guam. But when I'm in front of school children, or if I go to universities, I usually pull this map out and then point a little bit of MacArthur's thrust, through New Guinea and the Philippines, and then I go over Nimitz thrust as well. One thing I found as I was studying more and more about this, the importance of really emphasizing to people who love World War II history and people who need to get educated about it, the importance of amphibious warfare. If the Marine Corps hadn't focused on it in the 20s and 30s, we would have been years away from having the amphibious warfare that we needed when war came upon our shores in 1941. And the Marine Corps almost was disbanded after World War I. We've fought, me being a Marine, we have fought many times to fight against the government trying to shut us down or incorporate us into the Army. After World War I, the gentleman in the picture to the left in the middle, that's Howland Matt Smith, who was basically the father of amphibious warfare. And the guy with his hand up in the air, that's Graves Erskine, and he's to the right, pictured here, the three-star lieutenant general. And Graves Erskine was the brainchild for amphibious warfare. Howland Matt Smith was the politician to keep it in the forefront. What's interesting is in the 20s after World War I, we realized we're going to have a justification to remain a separate service, or we're going to get shut down. And the answer to that was, we are going to study amphibious warfare. And they focused on the disastrous campaign in Gallipoli by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill, in 1916, 1917 in Turkey. And they focused on what went well, which wasn't very much, and then what was disastrous. And from that, they started really getting into with research in the 30s, the Higgins boats, the Amtraks, the LSTs, and how to hit a piece of land very quickly and get tanks, jeeps, and soldiers and Marines on the shore, to the tune of 30 to 40,000 within an hour. No other nation could do what we could do at that time. In fact, today, we couldn't do what we were doing back then. And without the techniques of this guy, Graves Erskine, we should have universities and schools and streets named after this guy. He was an incredible mind. Because of him, we were able to hit the Aleutian Islands. We were able to hit North Africa. We were able to hit Normandy when we did, and do it very effectively. Commandant Vandergrift and even General of the Army Eisenhower said if we hadn't developed the Higgins boats and Amtraks and amphibious warfare, the end of the war would have been 3 or 4, possibly 5 years off from where it did end. So I go really into this, and I pulled Erskine's file, and it hadn't been opened from the 50s when he retired. I couldn't believe it, and it was a treasure trove of learning about this man and his service to our nation. So I really go in this this book into the Battle of Guam. A lot of people don't know we had a battle there. More importantly, I think this was American territory. American nationals were on this island when Japan took it over in December of 1941. And they built 7 concentration camps and killed 10% of our nationals during World War II on this island, many of them in camps. It was a miniature Holocaust on American soil, and nobody knows about this. So I talk about that. I talk about the campaign. Woody was in this campaign. He was in one of the largest, or he experienced one of the largest Japanese banzai attacks of World War II. If you take the Orte Peninsula and then Asan, if you look at the 3rd Marine Division, the top blue in the water, he was in the 3rd Marine Division, and where they attacked, that's Asan Beach. And then you'll see Fonte Hill a little bit in front of it. Well, that's now called Banzai Ridge. And on that ridge, 5,000 Japanese attacked us 3 days after we landed, or 3.5, 4 days after we landed. We landed on the 21st of July. They attacked us on the 25th. At the same time, on Orte Peninsula, just a little bit to the south, They attacked us with 3,000. So if you combine that together, it's about 8,000 men, Japanese men, conducted banzais on the 25th, and we defeated them. But it was a really scary time to be a Marine fighting the Japanese at this time. Is basically 8,000 men was 60% of the force that Japan had on that island that they threw at us, and Woody survived it. You know, this is me talking about the amphibious warfare, the troop carriers going to Guam. This is an aerial photograph of them. Woody was probably in one of those ships at this time. That's the attack at on Guam, the Higgins boats and Amtraks hitting the shore. That's the Asan Beach, that where Woody landed. I, snorkeled out there. Tanks and Amtraks and everything are out there underneath the surface of the water. That's what they attacked. That's Banzai Ridge, and I walked up that. It's about a mile up to the very top. If you see, you'll see a little bit of a structure in the middle of the first hill by some trees. That was Nimitz headquarters during the Pacific. And it's also called Nimitz Hill, but it's also called Banzai Ridge. And that's where 5,000 guys came over that top there and hit us on the 25th. And we were right below it when we got hit. That's the very top. That's where they came over that and hit us. We were basically entrenched right here. It was brutal terrain and a brutal attack. There's an Amtrak at the top, and then getting off into the Higgins boats is below. These are some of the photographs in the National Archives that a lot of times, from what I've seen, have not been seen the light of day. These are some of the Japanese we fought there at Guam that were found in the caves that I found in the archives there on Guam. To write this book, ladies and gentlemen, I went to 18 different institutions in 5 nations. I went to Germany, I went to Guam, I went to China, Japan, and then all throughout America. And then I wrote places in Canada to gather all my information that I did. At the end of it, I gathered around 30,000 pages of primary sources to write this book. And then I conducted 60 interviews with veterans. There's me with my sons at the time in the caves. We found ammunition, we found bones, we found everything in the caves. We're up here on the top of the Nimitz Ridge that you see here in bold lines. And that's where the Japanese came out and attacked us and split us and basically drove some of us into the sea. But it was a Pyrrhic attack, if you will, or a victory. And we quickly countered attack. We got hit about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and by 6 o'clock in the morning, we had killed everybody. And we had to bulldoze them all into mass graves. They did these massive picket charge, banzai charges that, if you were in the front vanguard of taking on that charge, you were going to die. But because they were so massed together, it was easy to tear them up and kill them with machine gun fire and counterattacks. There's some bones we found of a jaw and I guess a shoulder bone, and then some ammunition in one cave. Japan was slaughtering young men all over the place. You found countless places with skulls all over the island. Japan would kill a lot of the young men because they were worried about them having an insurgency once we attacked. After the war or the battle, Chamoras, as they're called, they were so grateful that they immediately started Boy Scout troops. They could have freedom of religion again. And Guam has the highest percentage of its young men going into our service, even to this day, of any territory or state. They're very proud to be American, and they're very proud of what America did to liberate them from the Japanese. I went into this, like I said, and I went into this and documented the entire company that Woody Williams was in, and this was his company commander. And found out, I'm very good friends with his son, who's a Vietnam veteran, got all his personal papers, his memoirs, and so on, and incorporated it into the work. This was one of Woody's good friends who died on Iwo Jima. He was a gentle giant, 6'5", massive athlete, and got the Silver Star for taking out a few positions on Iwo Jima by running up and throwing demolition charges into cave entrances. This is Lefty Lee. I found that he made up a whole story of being on Iwo Jima. He did get to the beach of Iwo Jima, but then he had a psychological break and he was removed for psychoneurosis. He was basically, bless his heart, he was a babbling idiot. And that was a big disappointment to find that Lefty had lied all about his experience and was never there with Woody. But what's interesting is Woody had used them throughout the years to tell the story. And when I asked Lefty, where did you get all the details that you did? Lefty admitted to me that he got it from an article that Woody had given in 1945. And I later found out that article was what had started his Medal of Honor recipient process. And it was an article he gave with all this information that later on I found was false. So, and Woody knew it. He knew that that information was not correct. And what's interesting here is that he allowed Lefty to regurgitate the stories from back in 1945 that he was making up, making his lies, his truth by having Lefty present the information and not he himself. Now, to be fair to Woody, he was a young 20-year-old, 8th grade educated West Virginia boy, high school dropout, very unsophisticated. His unit of 270 men on Iwo Jima got torn up, and there was only a few dozen that were able to walk off the island of Iwo Jima. So he's very proud that he survived. But when he started talking about his exploits on Iwo Jima, which he did many heroic things on Iwo Jima, no doubt, his 4-pound bass just got turned into a 20-pound bass. And it was really kind of sad how the story got out of control. And this was the beginning of me figuring out how it got out of control and why it got out of control, learning about Lefty's tall tales. There's Woody's enlistment photo from the National Archives. That's him in the CCC before the war with his mom. That's the receiving barracks in San Diego that he went to. I like the little propaganda sign. If you want an island, tell it to the Marines. Oh, this is something else. All the information I got about his training in boot camp and all these photographs of boot camp just got opened up in the archives there in San Diego that nobody's really used. So I was very happy to incorporate that information in my work. There's guys marching in 41, becoming Marines. There's the 2-prong attack. Once again, I showed this photograph to a lot of people to get them a feel for this size of this operation. What people don't realize is Japan at its height had 1/7 of the circumference of the earth under its control and had 600 million people under its domain. In contrast to Hitler, who only had 450. So it was a massive empire. There's General Kuribayashi. Brilliant general, but also a criminal. These are some of the weapons for guys who are nerds. They really like this photograph to see the exact type of weaponry we were facing of the Japanese. And this was what our intel department had collected to give to a lot of the officers that were going to attack Iwo Jima so they would know what they were facing. These are tunnels in Iwo Jima. What's interesting is I think I got the definitive work from the Japanese archives. Kuribayashi in an 8 square mile, so it's 1 square mile island, 1/3 the size of Manhattan, had built 11 miles of tunnels underneath that could not be penetrated basically by our 16-inch guns, 2,400-pound shells. And his garrison of 22,000, almost 21,900 men, 4,000 of them were combat engineers. He knew he needed to build a fortress underground to be able to do the type of attacks he wanted to do once we got there, and to protect his men from the shelling. So he wasn't going to attack, going to defend the beaches like other guys had. He was going to be silent and inside the island. And then as soon as the war began, it was like a gopher hole a prairie dog landscape type of environment where they would come up these holes, fight us, and then go back down. And then there was pillboxes everywhere to the tune of 5,000. 5,000 pillboxes, bunkers, and reinforced cave entrances. So it was an incredible fortress to attack. This was the Japanese map I found, sent by Kuribayashi's headquarters back to Japan, showing all the different lines of defense. You had to just, it's like peeling an onion going through this island to defeat it. You had to go layer by layer by layer, and this was the brilliance of General Kuribayashi. That's our map, aerial photography. All the little dots that you see are actually big dots. Those are big bunkers and big pillboxes. And then the tiny little ones, if you got really close to it, were small bunkers. This was done in October of 44. When we did our last mapping, aerial photography in January and February, before we landed on February the 19th, 1945, a lot of these little dots had disappeared because Kuribayashi had taken them even deeper underground and into the topography of the island. This is just kind of give you a feel of where we landed, the different color of the beaches. 5th and 4th Marine Division hit it on the 19th. On the 21st, the 3rd Marine Division was deployed. It was only thought to be held in reserve. We thought there was only about 9,000 guys on the island. You know, Kuribayashi had 22,000. We thought we'd be able to take it over in a few days. And as many of you know, it took 36 days. We lost 7,000 boys on that island, 19,000 wounded. We lost more dead there than all the dead we've experienced in Gulf War I, II, and all the activities in Syria and Afghanistan the last 30 years, to put it into context. There's the island from our window, my son and I looking out at Mount Suribachi, and then the landing beaches there to the right. There's the landing beaches back in 1945. It was an incredible ballet of how we would land troops with Amtraks, and we'd have a miniature little blitzkrieg, amphibious blitzkrieg, to develop a metal wall with cannons and machine guns to then provide protection for the Higgins boats to come up and deploy the troops. The troops would secure the tanks and secure the area, and then big LSTs would come in with hundreds of other Marines, and then Jeeps and tanks and so on, through their butterfly doors. There's the Marines going to hit the beach with Mount Suribachi in the background. There's the beach today after crawling up Mount Suribachi. There's the beach back then going up the berms. As many of you know, going up those berms is like, you know, walking up coffee grounds. You take a few steps and then you get pulled back. There's my son doing it back in 2015 with a 30-pound pack, and he's complaining. You can see the sand in front of him where he had made it up a little bit further, but then it drew him back down. And he's yelling that it's so hard, and the Marines down below are saying, "Shut up, kid. At least nobody's shooting at you." And so here's, you know, this is an example of one pillbox of many that we took out. A couple of dead Japanese out in the front if you look close. If Japanese was going to get close to being taken prisoner, he would take a grenade and put it to his head a lot of times and blow himself up. If you look closely, his right arm is missing, or right lower arm is missing, and his face is all blown up. If you look in the right-hand corner, you'll see how well camouflaged the bunkers were. You'll see the slit there to the right, and these were the bunkers and pillboxes that we had to continually take out. Usually 4 or 5 guys were in there manning a machine gun. We had to blow them up, burn them out. There's flamethrowers. And the reason why I named my book Flamethrower, this is another little interesting factoid that a lot of people don't know about. 1/3 of all the Japanese who died on Iwo Jima weren't blown up or shot. They were incinerated. They were burned up because they weren't on the island. They were in the island. And the only way to get to them was with flamethrowers, with our tanks, or with portable flamethrowers like you're seeing right here. So Woody was very instrumental in being able to take this island because he was trained as a flamethrower. And the activities he did one day with a flamethrower, taking out possibly 3, definitely 2 pillboxes. In the official record, it was thought to be 7. But even so, 2 or 3 was a normal day, but still a tough day, taking out pillboxes, and you had to do it with flamethrowers. Iwo Jima was the same way. You see it in Hacksaw Ridge, the movie. That 1/3 of all the Japanese killed there as well were incinerated. So this is going to be one of our main weapons, especially when we attack Japan. And that's why I know more about the flamethrower than most people, and I talk about all the science behind it. It carried 9 gallons of fuel, and those 4.5 gallons in each tank. It was a mixture of half diesel and half high octane aviation fuel. The center tank was compressed nitrogen because it's not flammable like oxygen. And it could spray out about 20, 30 yards in your front and as wide as 20, 30 yards. And the degree heat was 3,500 degrees. If you hit a body with it within about 3 seconds, it was all the moisture been sucked out of it and it was on fire. It was a terrifying weapon. You had about 9 to 11 seconds of burst before you went empty. Woody climbed up on a pillbox, and this is an artist's rendition of what he did and took out several guys one day. There's Woody with a flamethrower after the war. You tended not to want to be in a foxhole with a flamethrower. Here you see a guy got hit and it exploded. And if you look closely at this photograph, which I have, there's 4 dead bodies in this crater where they were taking refuge when a mortar came in and hit the flamethrower guy. That's a famous picture of a flamethrower operator going into battle at Iwo Jima. Famous flag raising. Finally, the Marine Corps, after 80 years, got it right. They misidentified 3 of the guys. And for those of you who don't know, after watching Flags of Our Fathers, Doc Bradley, who everybody thought was in the center of this photograph, that's not him. That's Schlitz, I guess is the guy's name. So that whole movie about Doc Bradley is fabricated. And I do believe James Bradley, his son, when he's writing his book, must have known that, because when you look at this uniform, it's not a medic uniform, it's a Marine Corps uniform. And Doc Bradley definitely knew he wasn't in this photograph. He was in the first flag raising, no doubt. This was the second one with the larger flag, but it was the famous one. And it was the one that Flags of Our Fathers was focused on. So it's really kind of sad that a movie was made to honor these guys when one of the guys wasn't even in there. And there's a lot of evidence to show that he knew he wasn't in there. And the family knew it too. The red harvest of war is never pleasant. We buried a lot of guys on the island, and I talk about how they did this. A lot of the men I documented in this company didn't make it off the island alive, and so I document how we treated them, how we honored them, how we built out the cemeteries. One of the biggest controversies, and I know I'm running out of time, is Rabbi Gittleson, who was the first Marine rabbi to be attached to the chaplaincy corps with the Navy, to be attached to the Marine Corps, was on Iwo Jima. He was a pacifist in the 30s, but then he realized pacifism didn't work against the Nazis and the fascist Italians, so he decided to join. And then he sent to one of the most hellish battlefields known to mankind. Well, it's interesting, and you should look this talk that he gave called The Purest Democracy. It'll bring tears to your eyes. But the backstory is fascinating, and it's in my book. And that is, he was earmarked, because he was the most eloquent chaplain in the 5th Marine Corps Division, to give the keynote talk at the dedication of the 5th Marine Corps Cemetery. Well, all the Catholic priests and half of the Protestant chaplains refused to attend that, they said to the commander, because he's a Christ killer. He's a Jew. He's going to hell. We don't want him giving the dedication over Christian bodies. And it became a huge controversy. Well, Gittleson, being the gracious man he was, went to his commander and said, hey, let's just split up in 3 different communities. Let's have a Catholic dedication, a Protestant dedication, and I'll do the Jewish dedication. And then we nullify this conflict. His commander didn't like that, but he says, okay, that will at least make the peace. So Gittleson did this, and a couple of Protestant ministers who were so disgusted by the priest and so disgusted by their comrades, attended it. They were so taken with the talk that they got a copy of it, made thousands of copies of it, gave it to guys as they were leaving the beach. And before you knew it, a few months later, Gittleson is one of the most famous Marine Navy chaplains of World War II, and he eventually becomes the first rabbi to be in the Interfaith Council of a president under President Truman, because his speech really speaks to why we were there and what we were doing and the sacrifices. And so this act of bigotry, trying to shut him up, actually made him one of the most famous guys of World War II. So look him up, Rabbi Gittleson. There I am on the island. The Japanese make you dress up with coat and tie because it's still a graveyard. There's still around 11,000 Japanese in this island, and they find them every year. Here's this interview that was done with Woody that I found in the archive, and found a lot of the problems. If you look at the very bottom of the first page, you'll see he says, I counted 21 of them. And you look at the top, and I killed them all with flames. Well, this is one story that later on I found not to be true. And later, Woody says he never even remembers giving this interview, but he gave this interview continually until the 60s, when a lot of the guys that started reading about his interviews who were with him told him to be quiet and were very upset. And after that, when he had this confrontation with some of his veterans, he just claimed from the 60s until he died that he had a fuzzy memory. Well, that's just one example of many of discrepancies I found in his original stories, what he told later on, and then what could be reported in the archive. What's very interesting is the three guys that did give testimony to Woody only documented about half of what his company commander thought Woody did. And the company commander was using resources like this that Woody had given. So when the Admiral Nimitz and his board, and Admiral General Geiger and his board, and Commandant Vandergrift and his board looked at the evidence, and they saw that what the guys witnessed were half of what Woody's captain thought had happened, they shut down the process. And as they investigated it more and more, fewer and fewer people were willing to endorse Woody, even his own platoon commander, Howard Chambers. This was one of the big articles that came out that got a lot of Woody's comrades upset. And he was regurgitating a lot of the story that he was given back in 1945 in that document that I just showed you. And then I go into the differences. They had to change up the citation dramatically once they did. Truman forced it through because all the information was not substantiated. It was a botched thing. When I had Commandant Krulak of the Marine Corps looked at this, he said this is the most messed up Medal of Honor process he had ever heard about or seen. And I go into all the documents from the archives. That's the platoon commander that refused to endorse Woody, and a brilliant mind. He took out 30 pill boxes in one day, leading 18 men, guys and ladies. Here's more information about the endorsements. I know more about how medals were awarded back then. This is asking Chambers. You'll see under enclosure big A. This is going to Chambers from Geiger. He's asking him for his testimony, and he refuses to give it. And here's the Navy Department fighting politically of getting this awarded. Woody eventually gets it fair and square. You know, Truman signs off on it, and this is his day on the 5th of October when he's awarded it. A huge ship landing expeditionary sea base ship, ESB number 4, is named after him. It has the displacement tonnage of 2 Titanics. Woody became very famous recently in doing Gold Star Memorial monuments all over the place. He's done an awful lot of good for veterans. That's Hirohito's grave. And it's basically 4 stories. And this guy was responsible for 30 million people dying. Yet he gets this big, send-off when he dies in 1989. I really believe MacArthur should have hung him up and brought him into the Tokyo War trials. Now, I'll leave you with this last thought. There's so much to talk about, and I know I've gone over, I've run out of time. But one thing that's very interesting about Iwo Jima that a lot of people don't put two and two together. We lost 7,000 boys dead, 19,000 wounded, many of the wounded, horribly wounded, missing body parts and so on. And we took over this 8-square-mile island defended by 22,000 guys, and the carnage was horrible. And the mothers and grandmothers and fathers were so distraught, and FDR was very distraught about this battle. And this had a huge impact, plus what happened on Okinawa, to our military minds and leaders saying, we don't want to experience this on Japan. We just took over Germany, we split it in half, and only when Hitler put a bullet in his head did they surrender. We're faced with doing the same thing with these guys fighting for their God in Japan. And if we're going to have the death and destruction that we saw on Iwo Jima, especially in Okinawa, we don't want to have that. There's 4.5 Japanese soldiers on Japan soil, supported by 20 million militia. That's a lot more than 22,000 on Iwo Jima. We're going to have a lot more body bags going back home, and they were estimating around 1 million. And so Iwo Jima had a huge impact on America dropping the bombs, and I really bring that fact to light in this book. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, I learned an awful lot of history that I hadn't known about before. I have over 300 photographs in this book. I think most of them have not seen the light of day. And like I said, half of the source material, interviews and primary source material, have not seen the light of day. So I think it's one of the definitive works on Guam, Iwo Jima, Japan's Holocaust, and then General Kuribayashi. And then it's the first, to my knowledge, biography of an enlisted Marine from World War II. And to kind of put the Medal of Honor in context very quickly, there were 669,100 Marines who served in World War II. 84 of them got the Medal of Honor. Only 32 survived their act to get the medal. So 52 died and got the medal posthumously. So that I actually was able to meet a Medal of Honor recipient from World War II and document him from the odds here was remarkable. So I know I ran over a little bit, but if anybody has any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you very much for that. Was the most exciting, illuminating, and interesting presentation. I noticed in your earlier pictures of the Japanese in their victory parades, they were all on horses. How mechanized was the Japanese military?
Well, just like the German military, not very. I mean, a lot of people think the German military was extremely mechanized, and the Japanese military, a lot of people felt the same way. They did have a lot of trucks. They did have a lot of tanks. Their tanks were far inferior to the Germans and the Americans. But just to put by way of illustration, when Germany invaded Russia with Barbarossa, their frontline tanks, they had 4,000 that they invaded with. But they and then you had armored cars and so on. So you had several thousand more armored vehicles, but their frontline tanks, basically, their Panzer IVs, you had 4,000. And they had to support that invasion over 600,000 horses. People don't realize that with the Nazi military. Japan was the same way. When they invaded Nanking, or when they invaded the space going toward Nanking, their army of 200,000 men were supported by 50,000 horses. So Japan was much less mechanized than the German and American militaries. And they all had to rely, but all military, well, not as much as America, but we had a lot of horses too. But Germany and Japan relied an awful lot on horses to get their invasions underway.
If there are any people that have questions, you have to unmute your microphones. Please do. I have another question if nobody else does, and that is, I was listening to a podcast talking about the ambassador to Japan. I think his name was Joseph Gray, and he mentioned how the culture was such that the honoring the emperor was so formidable that every last child would have died trying to defend the home island. And I always wonder about people who say the bomb wasn't necessary, the atomic bomb wasn't necessary. And to that, I have to say, listen to the veterans who fought and listen to, the people who know better. I don't think there was a way around it. And I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Well, one thing I do, when people become moralizing individuals about this, that we shouldn't have bombed them, it was a war crime and whatever, I'm thinking, what you don't realize is in the land, Japan still had millions of troops in China. They had almost 1 million in Indonesia, and they had troops. They had hundreds of thousands under Yamashita or Yamashita in the Philippines. And every week we delayed bringing the war to the end, minimum around 100,000 people were dying under Japanese rule in their Holocaust. So every week you delayed convincing Hirohito that he surrendered and should not fight to the death, hundreds of thousands of innocent people were dying.
Wow.
So that's just another reason to drop the bombs, besides saving American lives. And when you study Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and you look at how brutal and fanatic the Japanese were and how their citizens were dying on Saipan, Tinanin, and Okinawa, I mean, almost half of the citizens of Okinawa died, many of them forced to commit suicide by their own troops. It would have been a bloodbath. Japan should be thanking us because they think a minimum of around 10 million Japanese citizens would have died. So anybody who is moralizing, you got to say, okay, you want 10 million Japanese citizens to die? You want 100,000, at least 500,000, maybe every month of foreigners dying under Japanese rule to die, to delay the bomb, or to just, do a demonstration out in the ocean and hope that might be something that would convince Hirohito. The whole firebombing of Tokyo of March in 1945, when we killed 100,000, didn't do it. So you think just a little bomb out in the ocean? We had to show that one bomb could do incredible destruction to a city. And that really did turn Hirohito's mind. And also, I mean, the Russians helped by invading Manchuria, but a lot of people still wanted to fight to the death. Many of his leaders, after he declared surrender, committed seppuku because they thought that was ultimate disgrace.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank you again, Bryan. This was a very, very informative and interesting presentation, and I look forward to reading your book. I know I will be purchasing it, so I wanted to hear about it first, and I'm going to go out and get it.
Well, thank you. I see Richard has Matula has a question. So Rich, thank you so much. Please get in touch with me when you do read the book. You can find it on Amazon, guys. And then if any of you do read the book and have any questions, my email is on my website, bryanmarkrigg.com. Feel free to get in touch with me. Yes, Richard, you had a question, Matula?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned in your talk early in the war, maybe throughout the war, the culture of the Japanese military was, to use one word, rape.
Yeah.
And the vast amount of this. We didn't go into MacArthur's writing of the new Constitution after the end of the war. But my question is, we would not attribute that culture of raping to the Japanese today, or even maybe slightly after the war. What would you attribute the change in philosophy that occurred?
Yeah, I mean, a very good question. I mean, because now with the Taliban or with Mujahideen, they still have a culture of rape. In fact, they have a culture of sodomy rape, male and female rape, left and right. Japan had a little bit of that, but it seems like that's the MO for the Taliban and Islamic groups in the Middle East. So why doesn't Japan have that now? It's an interesting question. I think we did bring democratic values. MacArthur did write a constitution that embraced freedom of religion. They've had now 2 or 3 more generations in the modern world realizing that this is not right. Although Japan still has a weird culture. It's kind of like in Italy, you know, everybody Catholic there, they have their wife for breeding and they have their mistress on the side for fun, even though they're a Catholic nation and they don't believe, you know, the doctrine of Catholicism is not to, you know, be an adulterer. Yet most Catholic men, or many of them in Italy, practice that. Japan, you have the same kind of thing. You have your wife, but when you do business and whatnot, it's quite often acceptable to go to prostitutes, and the sex tourism throughout Asia is heavily populated by Japanese businessmen. So they still have the weird kind of, and we're still coming to terms in this culture about what is proper sex and what is not proper sex. I mean, look at the Catholic rape scandal of children that's come out. The UN report of 2014 believes that Catholic orphanages in Ireland, Scotland, England, and throughout America and Canada, 1/3 of all the children in those orphanages were sexually abused. And then, of course, Spotlight, the movie that came out. So you have a lot of problems with societies dealing with how do we deal with sexual crimes. Japan still is struggling with this to some degree. They didn't prosecute a lot of their people after the war for the sex crimes. They have a hard time coming to terms with the comfort women, which was one of the most horrific sex crimes against women in the history of mankind. And they haven't properly dealt with it. Now, we haven't really tested it yet either. Japan hasn't been fully deployed in a war, and we don't see how their JAG system works of how to prosecute their soldiers. I would like to think that 3 generations after World War II, that the democratic Japanese military has laws on the books that they would enforce that would prevent rape and sexual exploitation of the people that they would rule over. We were very stringent with our laws, and if we found guys raping in Europe and raping in Japan, and it did happen, we quite often prosecuted those people. And you know, and when I studied JAG as a Marine Corps officer, it was very explicit that you reported this, and this was a serious crime. And that we trained our men, you know, to be very mindful of this, and that they would be prosecuted the full extent of the law, and that the laws in the military actually are more stringent than the laws in society against rape. So that's an interesting question about why Japan has changed. I mean, we did bequeath them a whole new culture, if you will, but they're still way behind the times, I feel. Than America or Germany or Canada when it comes to viewing women. They have a yes. There was a question.
Just my name is Rosalie. I just wanted to say one thing. I remember reading a bit about, we were talking about the brutality of the Japanese soldiers. And part of it was that supposedly their leaders or commanders starved these guys. When they were in the caves waiting for the Americans to arrive, they would starve these Japanese soldiers so that when they went into battle, they were just out of control. They were fierce and didn't care what they did. But,
well, Rosalind, or
yes,
is it Rosalie?
Yeah.
Yeah. You are right to some degree. In the caves, they had quite a bit of food. I would say now toward the end of the battle at Iwo Jima, they had run out of food and they were starving. But when they went on campaign, you do have a good point. When they went on campaign, they didn't have a lot of supplies, so they had to live off the land. And the Chinese called the Japanese a flock of locusts, because wherever they went, they just killed all the animals and raped and pillaged and stole because they didn't have supplies. The logistics systems of the Japanese military was really pathetic compared to what the Germans were able to do and Americans were able to do in World War II. So you bring out a very interesting fact that a lot of their crimes came out from desperation of trying to feed themselves. But
Exactly.
still, it didn't mean that they had to brutalize the people and rape and kill them along the way as they did so, as when they stole their farm animals and so on.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian, there's, you know, a lot of information coming about the German soldiers using Pervitin, you know, amphetamine. Did the Japanese soldiers use any kind of drugs or medications to boost themselves?
No, they just had radical fanaticism. There were quite a few guys in China, and they did take some of it with them that had opium with them. They did get liquored up quite often on their bonsais on sake. But as far as the meth that was prevalent in German military, and we were given uppers to our guys until the 90s, you know, to keep them, especially our fighter pilots, go pills. So many militaries were doing this at the time, but I didn't catch anything in the archives of the Japanese taking drugs to stay awake. There is some reports of opium pipes on Iwo Jima, and all the islands they had sake, and they always got liquored up before they did their death by marine charges.
Okay, that would make sense.
Well, guys, thank you. So, Rich,
Thank
thanks so
you.
much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. And I will send out next month's meeting in a week or two. So I'll look forward to seeing you all again. And
Yeah.
Brian, thank you.
Fabulous.
Be in touch.
Thank you,
So-
Rosalind. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're gonna, let's see, stop sharing and we will end this. Let me see right now.
Have a great evening, guys.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye.
now.